Today's podcast topic, whistleblower issues in the pharmacy field. This is an area of whistleblowing that has just exploded, I would say, in the last 10 years. And we have a special guest today, an actual pharmacist who has been practicing pharmacy for 30 years. His name is Ben Alpert, an individual I have known for many, many years. He is a pharmacist down in Sarasota, Florida. Ben, it's so great to have you on one of our podcasts. Can you tell us a little bit of background about when you went to school, how long you've been practicing, and your experience?
Yeah, I got my license in early 1994, and I've been practicing both retail pharmacy and long-term care pharmacy for about the last 30 years, both in New York and Florida.
And you're licensed in both of those states, I understand.
That's correct.
You've worked in both of those states.
I have worked in both New York and Florida, yep.
All right, so you have seen some of the problems. I know you're aware of general whistleblowing issues and laws. Now, Ben, by the way, is not a lawyer. He is simply a pharmacist, and it's not such a simple thing. I mean, it's a very complicated profession. It is a lot harder than it looks. Ben, can you tell us some of the major problems that you have seen, I'd say, just over the long haul, over the last 30 years? What would you say the most common problem you've seen as a pharmacist in various pharmacies?
I think right now the worst problem in pharmacy is just massive understaffing, partly because of COVID and giving the vaccines and the testing and everything related to COVID, the questions, the free masks, the home tests, the pharmacies are just incredibly understaffed. And pharmacy is a very detail-oriented profession, whether it's, getting the prescription correct or billing the prescription correct. You need the time and the focus to do the most minute thing correctly. And if you're massively understaffed, which they all are right now, you really can't do the job correctly. And that's why if you look in the news, you'll see massive wait times. In some states, even the Board of Pharmacy is getting involved because the understaffing is so bad that if a pharmacist calls out sick, there's really no one to replace them. We had a situation in my company where we had 8 different pharmacists with COVID at the same time, and there was really barely anyone to cover the shifts. So say the understaffing right now and all the issues that come from the understaffing is the biggest problem right now.
Can you talk about some of those issues? I mean, I can imagine an older person down in Florida, 78 years old. Give us a scenario where someone like that has some prescriptions that have to be filled very soon. What can happen to that person?
Well, if you look in the news, you can just see massive lines, both at the pharmacy counter of people in line and also at the drive-thrus of just massive lines. I mean, some of the pharmacies were telling people that any prescriptions from today won't be filled at least until tomorrow. So they were at least a full day behind. I mean, you had pharmacies that were behind by 1,000 prescriptions. So imagine somebody being released from the hospital and some doctor at the hospital sending over, let's say, 6 or 7 prescriptions to a pharmacy, and that patient's discharged home that day. They can't get them for 1 or 2 days. So that means they're not on any medication for 1 or 2 days. So it's a massive problem. In my opinion, these pharmacy companies could be solving it tomorrow if they would just double the staff in these places. But because they're making money hand over fist by working these people harder and having a skeletal crew, they're not going to do that.
And as far as you know, there's no shortage of pharmacists. It's not like the nursing.
There's no shortage of licenses. No, there's no shortage of licensed pharmacists. No, there is not. But the problem right now is the few jobs that are open, they're so hellacious that it's hard to hire because a lot of the pharmacists don't want it. They know how bad it is. They know how understaffed they're going to be. But if the staffing problem could just be solved, then you would actually have more applicants and more people willing to take the job.
Understood. I want you to talk about the most recent crisis, and this is probably over the last decade or so, could be even longer, and talk about that. I know that's the opioid situation that's going on in this country, and what do you see in that crisis? What's your bird's eye view of it from a pharmacist's position?
Well, the bottom line is 20 years ago, out of every 100 prescriptions, I probably would fill one opiate. And now out of every 100 prescriptions, I probably fill 20 opiates. I mean, the bottom line is that 20 years ago, both the medical field and the federal government essentially took the position that people have the right to be pain-free and that they're going to treat pain like almost like a vital sign. And the reality is that you can give a medication like an opiate to somebody for pain, but they still become dependent on it. And what happens is somebody has an acute injury that, let's say in Europe, let's say somebody breaks their arm and they're given a prescription for Motrin. But here in the States, they're given a prescription for Percocet, for an opiate. And slowly but surely over time, if that person doesn't watch it, that person will become dependent on that opiate. And over time, with tolerance, the doctor will have to either increase the strength, increase the dose, increase the number of tablets. And sure enough, 20 years later, you have somebody who's still on opiates. But at that point, they're no longer treating the original pain. They're essentially giving opiates to someone who's just dependent on opiates. And it's a huge problem that's only getting worse, because when these people can no longer get the opiates through a doctor and a pharmacy, they turn to the streets. And at first it was heroin, but now it's much worse. It's essentially fentanyl, which is not even grown naturally. It's made synthetically. Fentanyl is like a synthetic heroin, which is 10 times to 50 times stronger than heroin. And the Mexican cartels are using essentially Chinese chemicals, and they're smuggling fentanyl across the border. Or what they're doing is they're taking other tablets, legitimate pain pills or legitimate medications, and they're essentially infusing it with fentanyl. And a lot of these people that are buying what they think is Percocet or Vicodin is actually laced with fentanyl, which is a lot stronger. And that's why you have so many deaths from opiates right now. So essentially, the problem was started by medicine and the government, but now it's being taken over by these cartels that don't really care how many people die. But the opiate problem is just a huge, huge problem.
And a pharmacist, I suppose, notices this. Let's say part of the pharmacist's job is to be aware of who's on what. I mean, it seems like that's the way it used to be. And anyway, I mean, it used to just tying into the first issue you talked about, the understaffing. I remember I used to go to the pharmacy, whatever it was, CVS, and it was like a real thing. It was like the pharmacist knew you. He understood what your prescription was. He understood what it was being treated for. And I would imagine if a pharmacist saw that somebody's on fentanyl for 2 years after a minor traffic accident, there's a problem. But I guess the profession has changed, where the scenario I've laid out is just ancient history. Is that right?
Yeah, it's partly ancient history, and it's partly because pharmacy as a profession has been taken over by these large chains, which are essentially big corporations, and they go based on sales. And a lot of the opiates are very profitable. So they pressure the pharmacist to fill as many as they can, or as is presented to them. And when the pharmacist refuses, they get phone calls from either the corporate office or their district manager asking why they refuse to fill a prescription. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly within our right to refuse to fill the prescriptions. We are not agents of the doctor. I'm not enslaved to fill a prescription just because the doctor wrote for it. I'm considered an independent practitioner. So I have a right to refuse to fill the prescriptions, especially if I notice what the DEA calls red flags, which is essentially pain management not done correctly, somebody being on the same medication over and over again without anything being resolved, doses going up, et cetera, et cetera. But the bottom line is there's a lot of money pressure, there's a lot of profit pressure, a lot of sales pressure on the individual pharmacist to just fill the prescription.
This is such a rampant problem that touches, I can think of 3 or 4 areas of law. Everything from antitrust. Do we want these pharmacy companies, CVS, Walgreens, do we want them controlling the pharmacy market? Because this is what you get when you have a couple of large corporations controlling an entire industry. Very, very hard to supervise, very hard. I mean, like, has the Justice Department ever done anything from the United States?
The Justice Department looked into a case at Walmart where the pharmacists were claiming that they were being pressured by the district managers to fill opiate prescriptions that they were not comfortable filling. And the Justice Department in Washington, D.C. considered essentially a criminal indictment against Walmart, and it never happened. We don't know why. It was during the Trump administration. But the bottom line is nothing. If you look at all the opiates that have been dispensed by all these big chains, which essentially seeded the problem of this opiate epidemic, the only thing that's happened so far is now certain states and certain counties, certain municipalities are suing these big chains, and they're winning because they were essentially, giving out these opiates when the pharmacists were not comfortable, and they were helping to fuel the problem of all these opiate deaths. So you do have a lot of civil lawsuits, both against manufacturers, like the manufacturer of OxyContin. The Sackler family has been in the news a lot because they marketed OxyContin, and also the chains that have been filling them. So the Justice Department really hasn't done much. I can't help but wonder why the individual state justice departments haven't done anything either. But the bottom line is, civilly, these chains are losing in court under these civil lawsuits.
That is a good thing. And I'm sure there is a tremendous amount of pressure for the pharmacists to blow the whistle to the pharmacy on these issues, which can lead to all kinds of discipline, bad reviews, loss of overtime, even terminations. I mean, I'm sure the pharmacies, when they retaliate, they're not going to say the reason we're terminating you is because you, the pharmacist, took your professional responsibility seriously, as you were trained to do in pharmacy school, protested something, and I'm sure that isn't the way it happened. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a very detailed field, so there's no way to show up every day and cross every T and dot every I, and these companies can always nail somebody on something. So, yeah, I mean, everyone just, in the end, just tries to be a go along, get along sort of person, and just they end up doing whatever the company wants them to do, usually.
Well, I do appreciate you being on today's podcast. I think we've had some excellent information here for individuals, pharmacists, pharmacy techs, pharmacy assistants, people who just work at pharmacies who notice these problems. And it is a brave man or woman who comes forward and blows the whistle. And it is good to hear that the tide is turning in this field, and it's about time. If you have been retaliated against on a whistleblower claim, contact our law office. This is an area in which we concentrate, and people know that. We're well known in the field. Also, we invite you to become a subscriber to the Morris Fischer Law podcast. It is free and a lot of good information. And if you are in trouble, we can help.